Class is now in session. I am Professor Hockey, and today we're discussing Game 31 of the regular season between the San Jose Sharks and the Arizona Coyotes, in which the Sharks have won 3-2. Now, the Sharks' last game was against the Anaheim Ducks, the worst team in the league, and the Sharks managed to win that one 6-1. But even at the end of that game, I mentioned how the Sharks didn't necessarily play amazingly in that game, but it was just a kind of a combination of the Sharks playing well enough and the Ducks being really, really bad that caused the Sharks to win, and also just generating some good scoring chances, scoring on them, and not really giving the Ducks much of anything to work with. Here tonight, I actually thought the Sharks looked better, at the very least through the first two periods, than they ever really did in that game against Anaheim. It's just that they didn't necessarily build as much of a lead in this one as they did against the Ducks. So this one starts off in the first period, and within just the first few minutes of this game, the San Jose Sharks already have full control of it. They get a goal from Hertl and then Nick Bonino for a fourth straight game to make it 2-0 San Jose, and they're just dominating the pace of play here in the first half or so of this first period. The Coyotes can basically get nothing generated, the Sharks looking extremely clean. Now, this is not to say that this is some sort of super impressive feat. Of course, the Arizona Coyotes are also not a very good team, but then again, the Sharks reside in the basement with Arizona, so it's not as though they're just that much better, but they certainly played as if they were in the early parts of this game. The Coyotes would manage to get one goal back. This would be on a 5-on-3 type of situation from Krause, but the Sharks took a lead into that second period, and it was a pretty comfortable lead just based on how they played, and that continued in the second. They would score the only goal in that middle frame. That would come from Nico Sturm, his 8th of the season, and the Sharks would hold a 3-1 lead going into the third. And in that second period, it was more of the same of in the first period. The Sharks just completely controlling the pace of the game. The Coyotes looked multiple steps behind San Jose, and generally it was looking like one of the cleanest games of the season until, of course, the third period rolled around. The Sharks took their foot off the gas, which is not necessarily something we see a lot of from San Jose. That's mostly because they're not usually in positions where they're kind of dominating games, but it was very reminiscent of when the Sharks were actually a competitive team a few years ago, when they would frequently have big leads against kind of bad teams and allow them to kind of walk back into the game. And that's kind of what the Sharks here did tonight against Arizona. They would score within the first few minutes of the third period from Bjugstad to get this game to within one, and the Sharks could kind of consider themselves rather lucky that they didn't end up in a tied game situation at any point in this third period, because the Coyotes did get a lot of very good chances. They hit a couple of posts, they had a couple of power plays, they had the time with the goaltender pulled. They certainly threw a lot of pucks towards the net, but Reimer made a couple of nice saves. There were a couple of nice blocks in front, and the Coyotes just didn't necessarily have that finishing ability to be able to get them back into this game. And as such, the Sharks, a game in which they definitely should have won with how they looked in the 40 minutes, came quite close to potentially losing at the very least near the end of it, but they would still take the 2 points. Having said that, this is now a 2-game winning streak for the San Jose Sharks, with both wins coming against quite bad teams that the Sharks, if you were someone hoping for the Sharks to lose, you would hope that they would be losing to these two teams. And so there would definitely be people out there who would be disappointed in the loss to the Anaheim Ducks, and even more disappointed in the loss to the Arizona Coyotes as well, or to the win against the Arizona Coyotes and the win against the Anaheim Ducks. On to the player lineup here. As the first line, we of course continue to have Meyer, Hertl, and Kevin Labanc, and this was probably the Sharks' best line of the night throughout this game. Even in the third period when the Sharks were struggling, it was many of the other lines for San Jose that frequently found themselves in the defensive zone, and when this line managed to come over for a shift, they would manage to shift the level of play into the offensive zone, so that was definitely good to see. I do want to commend Tomas Hertl for a bit of a resurgence. He was always kind of putting up points in the earlier parts of the season, which is why he now currently sits with 30 points in the 31 games played. But it feels as though over these past few games, he has really turned it up a notch. That could have something to do with the fact that the Sharks are playing games against worse teams, so maybe Hertl is more chance to excel. But ever since that big mistake he made in the third period against the Toronto Maple Leafs that you could say sort of cost them that game, he has put up 7 points in the last 5 games, and he has definitely been looking a lot better. Maybe still not at the level of 18-19 Tomas Hertl, but certainly better than maybe what we had seen from him last year when it was kind of in autopilot at times, it seemed, and even in the earlier parts of this season. Still, 30 points in 31 games, very, very close to that point per game pace in him playing every single game thus far this season is quite impressive. When it comes to the other two players on his line, of course, there isn't necessarily much more to say about Timo Meier, who continued to look like the Sharks' best forward here in tonight's game, so that's not that much of a surprise. But I do want to briefly mention Kevin Labanc because I did see a stat of his tonight as he once again ended up taking another penalty in the offensive zone that now he is at a -8 in terms of penalty differential. This means that he has taken 8 more penalties than he has drawn, which is a pretty big net negative. Not a very good thing for a player on your first line. So I mentioned a few reviews ago that it's nice to see Labanc engaged in the game, but hopefully that engagement can come with less penalties. I will say I wasn't necessarily totally in agreement in the penalty that he ended up getting called for in tonight's game. He goes for sort of a stick lift onto Nick Bjugstad, who did not have a firm hold of his stick, and this kind of just causes it to go flying away, and the referees call it interference. I can understand the reasoning, because then if you don't, you set a sort of awkward precedent, but this is also a situation of like, hey, keep a firmer grip on your stick, and this isn't something that's going to happen anyway. Kind of unrelated, but onto the second line, we have a bit of a replacement here. Barabanov did not get to play this game due to some sort of illness or injury. Doesn't seem to be particularly long-term, since this did come down to a game-time decision, but what ends up happening is that Couture ends up with Bonino, as usual, ever since the Matt Nieto injury on his wing, but also with Noah Gregor, so maybe not the most effective line on paper for the San Jose Sharks, but actually for the third period at the very least, this was a very effective line for San Jose. In fact, watching the first period or two of this game, I actually thought I'd end up having to say the unthinkable coming into this review, which was that Bonino may have been the Sharks' best forward on the night. But with how the third period went and how much this line ended up regressing at the end and how much the first line kind of just took control of it, that doesn't actually end up happening here. But it was still a very impressive first 30 to 40 minutes here for Nick Bonino and this line in general. Nick Bonino once again scores a goal. That is now happening for the 4th game straight, which is very impressive for someone who was not just not scoring through the first 25 games of the season, but actively looking bad while not scoring. I should also commend Noah Gregor, who returned to the lineup here, and he continues to be sort of being pushed in and out of the lineup, even though he seems to be like the most effective offensive player who actually is sort of borderline at this point, as in better than players like Lindblom or Gadjevich. Gregor was once again very effective at times here tonight, not necessarily in the most consistent manner, but he did get 3 or 4 very solid chances for themselves. But of course, in typical Gregor fashion, he did not actually end up finishing on these, and Couture was a very nice, in a way, complementary piece to his two wingers, which is not something that I thought I'd be saying, but it was kind of the fact. Again, these types of praises are levied to them during the first 2 periods. As in the third period, it definitely did fall off, and this line kind of struggled a bit in those last 20 minutes. When it comes to the third line, a bit of a similar situation, but the third line wasn't really much of a line here tonight. That is because Luke Cunnin left this game extremely early on with an injury. He did not return to play, and as such, Nico Sturm and Evgeny Svechnikov were kind of left in no man's land, having to take a couple of shifts with some different wingers, so it's a bit difficult to evaluate how this line did. I will mention I thought Nico Sturm had some solid chances here tonight, and of course did score a goal. Svechnikov, definitely less apparent, but not terrible, I would say, so I guess that's good. And then when it comes to the fourth line, actually a pretty solid game for the fourth line, or maybe I should say more so a pretty solid game for Steven Lorentz, who clearly was carrying the majority of the offensive load here for this Sharks fourth line. Lorentz had multiple very good chances here tonight, at least in the earlier parts of this game. Velmelka, the goaltender for the Arizona Coyotes, did a very good job at keeping Lorentz off the score sheet here tonight, because he probably could have had a goal, maybe even 2, had he had his way. So definitely a very good game for Lorentz. I thought Gadjevich himself was kind of This has kind of been the case for the San Jose Sharks fourth line over these past couple of games. It's really been Lorentz up here. Gadjevich is like decently close, but not really. And then Lindblom still continues to trail behind. Since the Sharks are so heavily injured, Lindblom does continue to have a lineup spot, and it makes sort of sense. But I imagine once Cunnin is healthy, depending on how long he's out or if he's even out for any sort of term at all, maybe he'll be back for the next game. And then once Nieto comes back and Barabanov comes back, I really feel as though Lindblom should be the first player to come out of the lineup compared to someone like Noah Gregor, who we have seen be pulled out of the lineup multiple times already. When it comes to the defensive side of things, we obviously have to talk about Erik Karlsson, who was definitely leading the way here tonight. There were a lot of great offensive chances. Many of the offensive chances I talked about earlier being generated by players like Gregor, like Bonino, like Meyer and Hertl. A lot of them were coming off of the back of Erik Karlsson. He was really doing a lot here offensively for the San Jose Sharks, but of course we did see the sort of double-edged sword of Erik Karlsson as well here tonight. A bit of a not the best play, if to put it lightly, on the Nick Bjugstad goal that led to the Coyotes to come within one. And while the Sharks would not get punished for this type of situation, it is the type of play that continues to plague at times Erik Karlsson's game this season. It is still very much an excusable situation considering Erik Karlsson currently sits at 38 points in 31 games and leading all NHL defensemen as he has been doing for like a month's time, if not more than that. Probably a couple of months at this point, but Erik Karlsson still on the offensive side an extremely effective game, and I also do have to give kudos to his defensive partner Megna, who played a pretty solid role in that as well. And I also want to continue to pump up the tires of Scott Harrington, who I was so critical of in his couple of games earlier on in this season. It has definitely been nice to see him have a bit of a mini resurgence here. It'll be very, very interesting, actually, if Ferraro is to return in the near future, of which defenseman will come out of the lineup. Obviously, it's not going to be Karlsson or Megna, I would imagine, and then Vlasic and Benning seem to be locked down as the Sharks' premier defensive pairing. When the going gets tough, you send out those two players. And so really the question marks are on that third pairing of Harrington and Shemek. And while Harrington has been very impressive, Shemek has also not been any sort of slouch either. He's also been doing a decent job on the offensive side of things. So I doubt Ferraro gets kept out of the lineup. You got to take out one of these players, and it's going to be a pretty interesting competition to see which of them come out. And then finally, to mention the goaltending, we had James Reimer come back here. It seems as though he is healthy. He did return from his injury earlier on and had a very, very rough outing, then went back onto the injured reserve. Now is back, seems to be healthy, and he played a very solid game here tonight, only let in a couple of goals, the first one on a 5-on-3. So while this was technically a savable shot, it is a 5-on-3. You have a lot of factors going through your mind as a goaltender of like where the puck could be passed to, so I definitely don't blame him on that situation. And of course Bjugstad is left entirely all alone here in front of him, so I don't really blame him on that one either. It was a solid game from Reimer, definitely better than what we have seen from Kakinen, who is currently Reimer's backup, so it seems as though he is still the guy here for the San Jose Sharks even after this somewhat brief injury. But that will do it for this review. The Sharks will be back in action on Saturday, so yet another decently sized break, and the Sharks will take on the Los Angeles Kings. So after a string of games, like I mentioned earlier on, against the basement dwelling teams like the Sharks also are, they'll now head up against actual playoff teams, and the Kings, who have been a very high scoring team thus far this season. We'll see if the Sharks end up getting into a blow for blow match like they had in that Vancouver game a few days ago. Class dismissed.